Grant Cameron has been studying the UFO UAP phenomenon since 1975. He is the winner of the Leeds Conference International Researcher of the Year Award, as well as the UFO Congress Researcher of the Year. There's a lot to unpack in this rare 10-minute interview. Stick around till the end, you will be rewarded. He speaks about UFOs' interest in nuclear missile silos and how coincidences may not be coincidences, but preordained destinies, soul contracts, as he calls them, where you are intended and you have agreed to travel certain paths, and events are laid out before you in your life to guide your paths. It's a fascinating look into the mind of a brilliant and fast-spoken intellectual thinker in the field of UFOlogy. Grant has published several books, including Charlie Red Star, Project Magnet, and the Extraterrestrial Phenomena, and he is perhaps the foremost authority on mental downloads as a topic, citing artists like Van Gogh, musicians like Paul McCartney, writers like C.K. Rowling, and physicist theoreticians like Nikola Tesla, suggesting there's a link between the conscious and unconscious mind, as well as our connection to the world of spirits and the afterlife, a topic close to my heart because of the multiple parallels that exist between alien abduction syndrome experiences and near-death experiencer accounts. Here at Project Bluebook, we dive deep into events that happened perhaps decades ago, even as we plan to address current events in the form of interviews. These interviews will coexist alongside the topic-oriented podcasts, and I welcome feedback from you good folks on this plan. But in this clip, Grant Cameron addresses the value and importance of perspective afforded by time, where you gain overview for comparison, importance of detail, and correlation of data that may not have been immediately available or obvious at the time. This is why it is important to revisit events of the past and show different aspects in a newly understood light, as we continue to do here on Project Bluebook, and as Grant Cameron speaks to in this clip. He also uses this occasion to explain how he got into UFOlogy in the first place. Let's listen to Grant Cameron.
I just published a book called Charlie Red Star that deals with a series of sightings that occurred in southern Manitoba in 1975, 1976, in which I was involved. I was university at the time, had a sighting, became enthralled with the whole story, recorded all the people in the southern Manitoba who had had sightings, and published a book which was never published. The significance of the story is that we had massive sightings in 1975, and this is something that's recorded in the book, but some parts we had to leave out because of length. That in 1975, my first sighting was 2 weeks after the end of the Vietnam War. And I think this sort of ties in, and it ties into nuclear weapons. That when this incident occurred, there was a series of sightings going on, not just in Manitoba, but in Minnesota and in Wisconsin and in Ontario. In Ontario, for example, there was huge triangles of dirt that were being pulled out of the ground. They were 15 feet on a side and about a foot deep, where the entire piece of dirt was lifted up and moved over, which is like impossible to do. In Wisconsin, they had so many sightings at one town in Wisconsin that the CIA actually sent 2 agents there to investigate what was going on. Minnesota had them. The other thing that was happening in 1975 was it was the highest year ever for cattle mutilations. There's never been a year that had more cattle mutilations than 1975. And those cattle mutilations were occurring in a large part around Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. And Malmstrom was shut down in 1967 by a UFO incident where they basically shut down all the missiles. But the base was revisited in 1975. They had a sighting of UFOs, as they did have at other U.S. Air Force bases along the Canadian U.S. border. And this would include Minot Air Force Base near the border of Canada and North Dakota, Woodsmith Air Force Base, which is on the Michigan Canadian border, Loring Air Force Base, which is on the Maine Canadian border, and all these were bases where they kept nuclear missiles. Some of them were Strategic Air Command bases. And in 1975, all those bases were visited by UFOs, and the UFOs were inside the weapons storage area over the nuclear missiles. So 75 was a very, very busy period of time all along the border. And I know this because Manitoba, where I was having the sightings, was going to be identified by the National Enquirer as the UFO capital of the world. There were so many sightings taking place. And the National Enquirer sent a reporter by the name of Bob Pratt up twice. And in those days, the National Enquirer would put out stories, and everything had to be on tape. So they did brilliant, brilliant work. Bob Pratt would come. He would tape every interview that we did. We'd go from person to person, and he would transcribe. He would provide me the transcripts. But he was always leaving. He would say, I got to go to Minnesota. He would fly out. He'd go to Minnesota. He'd fly back. Then he'd fly to Ontario. He was flying in and out all the time because it was going on all over the place. And everybody knew this. So there was this nuclear weapon connection, which became even more clear 35 years after. And this is one of the things I learned in ufology, is that when something's happening, you a lot of times don't really catch on to what's going on. It's not till years later that suddenly the pieces all sort of go together. And what happens was, in the maybe 10 years ago, I went back to Carmen, Manitoba, where the majority of the sightings took place. And I went to a guy by the name of Bob Diemert, who ran the airport there. And Bob was a very famous aviation guy. He was the guy that basically started the industry of rebuilding old World War II planes. He took a Japanese Zero out of the jungle, he rebuilt it, he sold it to the Canadian Aviation Museum, and he became famous for rebuilding these old planes. He was at the center of this big UFO flap, and he was like a tour guide. So people would come, they'd want to talk to Bob. He would tell them, okay, it comes from here, and he would take out the TV crews at night. So I went to Bob and I said, Bob, how many sightings did you have in 1975? And he said, about 150. And I said, well, how many sightings have you had since 1975? And he said, none. And so something happened in 1975. So I'm doing this lecture at the Eureka Springs Conference in Arkansas, and I said to him, so Bob, why were they here? Why did they come to Carmen, Manitoba? This is like some small town that has no industry, has nothing. It's 2,000 people in the middle of a bunch of wheat fields. And he said, well, you know why they were here. And I said, no, I don't, Bob. And he said, you know why they were here? I told you in 1975 why they were here. And I said, Bob, it's been 30 years, and I do not know why they were here. And he said, I told you the missile silos. And as soon as he said missile silos, I knew what he was talking about. Because anybody who lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada knows that if there's ever a nuclear exchange between the Russians and the Americans, we're the first to go. Because we're in the line of fire. And most people don't realize that the first target of the Soviets for their missiles is not Washington, it's not New York, it's not Los Angeles, it's North Dakota. Because unless you take out the missiles in North Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, you're not going to see what happens to Washington and New York. So we're the prime target. So we always knew that every 10th Russian missile will come short around top of Winnipeg. So we knew we'd be gone. So when he said missile silos, I knew everybody that from Winnipeg who's driven through North Dakota has seen these missile silos in these fields. And he even told me, he said, I told you I had the meeting with this U.S. Air Force guy at the bar on the border. And this guy had been scrambled. They had a UFO over a missile silo in North Dakota, and that they had sent in 4 planes from 4 different directions, and they were ordered to ram the UFO. And at the last minute, this Air Force guy told Bob Diemert that he had decided that it wasn't worth his life. He pulled out of the formation, and this thing zipped up into the opening that he had created. So when I started to research the missile silos, then suddenly I discovered that in February of 1975, exactly when the sightings started in Manitoba, the Americans had built pre-Star Wars. In 1980, when Reagan came in, they put in Star Wars, but it was in outer space. And they would have these missiles that would try to shoot the Russian missiles as they were coming out of the silo, as they were in outer space, as they were coming into the American atmosphere. They had these big 5 megaton ones that would try to get the Russian missiles in outer space. If those missed, then they had to install these little sprint missiles, 1 megaton sprint missiles, that would try to create a sort of a haze so that the missile coming in would be shredded. It would hit all this stuff in the atmosphere and wouldn't be able to get to the ground and would detonate in a high atmosphere. So they installed, in February, they had started to install 100 new nuclear missiles at a town called Nakoma, North Dakota, which is just south of the border, about 80 miles from the center of this flap of UFO sightings. They started taking them out in November. They had a negotiation with the Russians. They negotiated to take these out in November of 1975. That's when the sightings started to stop, and the sightings went away. And I suddenly, 40 years later, when I couldn't get the book published in the 70s, when I go to republish it, the rest of the story is there, which wouldn't have been there if I had published it in 1970. The other significant thing that I should mention, which is kind of bizarre, that I learned years later, was you always see things when the incidents are happening, you see them as random incidents. When I look back 40 years later, it doesn't look so random. I had no interest in UFOs. I did not go out. We were going to go out in February when the Winnipeg paper started covering this story, and we didn't go. So my friend and I said we were going to go. Then 3 months later, CKY TV in Winnipeg actually films the craft on the ground. It's the only story that I have ever heard of where a craft is caught on the ground. There are observers within a number of yards of this thing, and it jumps up in the air, and a TV camera picks this thing up as it's jumping in the air. And what happened was the TV crews had been out, numerous TV crews had been out there. They couldn't film it. CKY on the one night had just about got it. It was on the ground, but they couldn't get any film. So the second night, they're on the ground. They leave the camera at the end of the road. They go down to surround this thing. One of the cars gets within a few feet of this thing and sees this object, which is 50 feet high, like a movie screen on a 45-degree angle, tilted up into the sky, but it's not touching the ground. It's hovering. They go to get their bearings as to where they are. They look back and the thing is gone. And they go, where'd it go? They thought it had disappeared. It actually jumped up in the air. And here's the random part, that you assume that this is random. But what happened was the guy was out there in the road with the camera, saw this thing glow up, glow down, glow up, glow down. And he said, we've got to get something on film. The next time it glows up, I'm going to shoot. So it started to glow up, and he shot. And that's when the thing jumped in the air, almost as if the UFO at the other end is saying, are you ready? Get ready to shoot. And as he shot, and you started to see these things as random. So then I started to look at, was this random that these events had occurred, or did they occur because they wanted me out there? And then you go to this whole idea that I say is very important in the UFO field, that people always forget. Is it one life, or is it reincarnation? Because if it's reincarnation, then there's soul contracts, then we're agreeing to do certain things, and you start seeing things completely different, that very much of life is patterns that we've agreed to. And so 42 years after this event, I see that this incident had more than just me accidentally going out there, me accidentally seeing the thing, them accidentally getting this film, and this book not getting published. And so this is the book, Charlie Red Star, and it deals with the nuclear weapons. It deals with this whole sighting thing that led me down this rabbit hole where I was chasing the president, top intelligence people. It all started with this one single incident where I go out, and all I'm interested in doing is seeing, what is everybody looking at? I'm not interested in UFOs. I just hear that people have seen this thing. I go out there, and within an hour, this thing is not a light in the sky. It flies in front of the car, and my life was changed forever.